What will our economy look like when every single task that is now done by a human can be done by an AI instead? These questions have been answered by Tom Davidson on takeoffpeace.com. I've been playing with this model for the past 4 days, and in the past 2 days, I've published 2 videos that explain everything going on with these colored curves. So in this video, I try to focus on something else instead. I'll discuss what is going on behind the scenes. If you click on description, you have the full economic model. And in each of the squares, if you click, you have all of these equations that govern the economics behind the takeoff model that you can play along in the playground. If this is the first video you're watching, don't worry. I'll do a 30 seconds recap of everything you need to know to understand this video. And if you've seen my 2 previous videos, feel free to skip ahead at this timestamp. The short version is that you're trying to invest a lot of money into AI. And the 3 things you invest in is software R&D, hardware R&D, and more money spent on training runs. Those 3 things end up giving you more compute that you can use in practice to train your neural networks, which you can see here as effective compute in larger training run. And once you have those larger training runs, then you can automate more of this software and hardware R&D and invest more money into your training runs. And the reason why this model is interesting is that you can actually simulate what is happening inside of your system, which is in economics a semi-endogenous model. And what it enables you to do is to also model things like takeoff scenarios, where those straight lines in a log-log plot are actually power laws. So these positive feedback loops enable us to model what would happen as we get very close to AGI, when we can actually use our AIs to do all of the AI R&D for us, and therefore reach AGI even faster. This is what you see here, as when we approach 100% automation, we're basically approaching AGI, and we have those big jumps in log plots spreading across multiple orders of magnitude. And while we have our entire economy that is being automated, we can model also what will happen with global GDP, or the amount of compute in the world that is spent on training runs. And you see that these results are pretty dramatic as we get closer to AGI. But the question that still remains after all of the videos I made is, how do we model this with simple economic equations? So if you go on description here, you see the economic model. So if we click on the first box, investment, this is what we get. And if you don't know anything about economics and these equations look scary, don't worry. This is a beginner-friendly video. I'll try to go slowly with all of these equations, explaining you what is the core intuition behind it, so that you can have a basic intuition of what is going on behind the scenes in this simulation. So the simplest term you need to understand here is GWP, which is Global World Product, or total GDP. So GDP is basically every good and services that are being sold. So you need to think about everything that is being sold at your local grocery store, and all of these transactions, they all go into GDP. So if we look at the curve here, the global GDP is supposed to go from $100 trillion, so what we have right now, to something closer to a quadrillion dollars, so $1,000 trillion. So we would have a 10x increase in total GDP in the next 2 decades. And the question is, how is this capital being allocated to other things we care about? So here, to be more concrete, let's say you're saving 20% of your total GDP, and total GDP is $100 trillion. You're saving $20 trillion into more capital. And then the second thing when looking at these economic models is labor. How much human work is going into the task of producing goods and services and other things. So one way to look at this equation is that the growth in labor is just the derivative of labor divided by the labor, meaning that the growth in labor is actually just the derivative of the log of the labor. So the growth rate of labor is just telling you what is the slope of the labor in a log plot. So if we look at the labor here, we say that it's a straight line because this growth rate of labor is a constant. This is often used in economics to model things that change exogenously, meaning for variables that are coming from out of your system. In our model, more labor comes from more people working on the problem, meaning population growth. So this is what they mean by labor and true factor productivity change exogenously at fixed growth rates GL and GTFP. If you're confused about what TFP or total factor productivity means, you can just look at the equations, and basically when you're trying to compute your total GDP, TFP is just a factor that you multiply to everything else. So you can think of it as how much innovation you have in the world, and this total factor productivity, or TFP, is just something that's growing at a constant growth rate. You can just think of it as all of these innovations or things in the management of your company that are not being taken into account with your model. But these equations don't really talk about the things we care about, which is AI progress. So in these equations, we were looking at the hardware stock, meaning how many GPUs we're actually buying. So the amount of new GPUs we're buying depends on how much we're actually spending on compute from our total GDP and how good is our hardware. So let's say NVIDIA develops a new GPU that costs 100K. How many more flops can you buy with 100K? And more generally, how many more flops can you get per dollar? That's the term here, HT minus HD. And the reason why you have this T minus HD is because there's a delay between the time NVIDIA announces the better hardware and the time when everyone is using it in production. Let's say Google, OpenAI, etc. And finally, to get your effective compute, which is the compute you're actually using to train your models, you need to multiply the hardware stock with a factor here, which is the software level. And the software level is measured in 2022 flop divided by flop, which is basically how many flops from 2022 that you could use to train your models can you buy with a flop today. So let's say if here in 2040, you can use around 20,000 times more flops to train your neural networks that you are using in 2022. This means that your software efficiency level is 20,000. So here you will be multiplying this hardware stock by 20,000. So this first basic block of investment tells you how you invest your GDP into more compute. But the most important part for me is when we start looking at automation and AI R&D. So here in automation, we're really talking about something that is central to the model, which is takeoff speed. How do we go from 20% automation in 2036 to 100% automation in 2040? So in this model, there are two things that are being automated. One is goods and services, which are the things that are being described in these 20% automation and 100% automation of goods and services. And the other thing you can automate is AI R&D itself. And the main claim of this work is that AI R&D will be automated before goods and services, and this will enable goods and services to grow faster. And the core intuition behind this automation model is that for both goods and services and R&D, you have a limited number of tasks that you need to do every year. So let's say you have 100 tasks to do, and all of the different tasks that you need to do require a different amount of compute. So here, from task 1 to task 100, you have a huge differential in the amount of compute going from 1 E30 flop to 1 E36 flop. The basic idea is that as you get more and more compute, you're able to automate more and more of these tasks. And this is the amount of compute for goods and services. And if you go into the amount of compute for AI R&D, I think the values are slightly lower, 3E35, whereas before for goods and services, you would go until around 9E35. There's a factor of 3 behind goods and services and R&D, because we're assuming that AI R&D is easier to do than goods and services in general, which is a parameter you can change here in training goods versus R&D. So the main intuition here is that you have some amount of compute from before, and you're saving some amount of this compute to do more training. And once you have a task that you can dedicate a lot of compute on it, you just spend this compute to do a large training run. And with this large training run, then you have a model that knows how to do a task. And then once you have trained your model to learn this task, you can just do inference and spend much less compute. So it's basically a model where you spend a lot of money to train something on a task, and once you know how to do the task, you don't have to spend that much compute anymore. And then there's the question of, when we reach like very complex tasks, do we need to train super large models, or can we get away with smaller models that we can then deploy at scale? And with a lot of those small models, can we get the same performance on the task as with the large model? So let's say instead of training GPT-8, you train GPT-7, but you run 1,000 GPT-7 at the same time at inference. And these 1,000 GPT-7 at runtime will enable you to solve most of the tasks that your GPT-8 solve. This is what these last paragraphs are about. We're trying to use excess runtime compute to make up for a smaller training run. And then once you have your task that is automated, you end up with some compute to labor efficiency, which is this number. And the compute to labor efficiency tells you how much you can trade compute for labor. So let's say your compute to labor efficiency is 0.5. It means that you will need 2 AGIs to do an AGI task instead of having one human. And more generally, it tells you how to trade compute to labor, which will make more sense when we reach the production equations. So this is the point when we have a bunch of complex equations. And if you have never studied economics, you will feel that these equations are very complex, but actually they're pretty simple. So I'll just give you the core intuitions behind it, and you can just look into them into more detail later on. So these equations just tells you that your GDP depends on the capital that is being spent on goods and services and the amount of cognition that goes into goods and services, where cognition here is just some aggregate that tells you both what our AIs are doing and what humans are doing. So it's a sum of both the cognitive work by humans and the cognitive work by AIs. And the general form of all these terms surrounding this cognition and capital with these factors on top here and on top here is just like a way of figuring out how much you can trade capital with cognition. But how do you define how much cognition you have? So first you have your non-AI compute task, CG0, where basically you can only use your humans to do them and some compute. But the other cognitive tasks here are tasks that you can use AI to automate. So you can just use some labor, so some human labor, which represent the amount of work that humans are doing. And then you can use your compute that you multiply with your compute to labor ratio that we've discussed previously here. So this is the compute to labor efficiency factor that tells you how much more labor can you get by spending more compute. So when you're here to do a task, you can either spend more labor or spend more compute that you multiply to your compute to labor efficiency factor. And if you sum all of these things, this tells you how many tasks basically you're fully doing by using compute and labor. This was for CogG, which is the cognition that goes into doing more goods and services task, meaning the tasks that go into your GDP. But then to automate AI R&D, you have two different things to take into account. One is hardware R&D, and the second is software R&D. For hardware R&D, you need to think of like NVIDIA doing more experiments and trying to figure out how to have better chips. In this case, what actually matters is capital and cognition. But for software, you don't actually need a huge amount of capital in advance. You don't need to buy billions of GPUs to do your experiments. You can just like rent your GPUs. So this is taken into account with hardware stock, which is a proxy for renting some physical compute for more experiments. If we go back into these equations, the cognitive input to hardware is this variable that we've just looked at. And all of this cognitive input to hardware R&D is then translated into research input to hardware R&D. So the RH variable here that takes into account capital and cognition. And this research input is less dramatic, but still spans multiple orders of magnitude between 2034 and 2040. And finally, we can jump from this production block that talks about hardware R&D inputs into this R&D block that talks about hardware efficiency and software efficiency. So what we were looking at in the playground before were actually software and hardware efficiency and not the hardware R&D inputs. And the hardware and software inputs were actually the things I was mentioning here. So in this case, hardware and software are basically the same, but the only difference are the different parameters we use for returns to hardware and returns to software, and other parameters that control stuff like stepping on toes. So if we look at the hardware R&D case, we have a parameter RH, which is our research input to hardware R&D. And what this is telling us is that if you integrate all of the research efforts from the distant past to now, and you take into account some stepping on toes factor, which is you still do this factor on top to see how much your different elements are elastic, how much you can substitute one for another. By doing this integration, you get this cumulative research progress. So this is QH, and the difference between your cumulative research progress and your actual hardware efficiency depends on a parameter that is returns to hardware. And to understand this derivative divided by a variable here, this is just, again, the derivative of a log and another derivative of log. So this is just telling you that you're multiplying the slope of a log curve by a factor returned to hardware, which if we look at the actual numbers, here it's 7 for hardware and 1.7 for software. And so this actually gives you hardware efficiency and software efficiency depending on the inputs we've discussed before of research input to hardware R&D and research input to software R&D. And finally, to close the loop, this hardware efficiency and software efficiency can then be plugged directly into the effective compute calculations. The thing that we have at the beginning for investment is the same at reinvestment, and it's the thing where you compute the amount of compute you have as hardware stock times software efficiency, and you use the actual hardware efficiency here in this formula. And to run these simulations here, you just run this thing step by step by doing some Monte Carlo analysis, where if we go into reports, I think you have all of the different parameters that you can plug into your model, and you vary them a little bit, and this gives you all of this different analysis, and this is basically what this model is doing. So this is my last video on this takeoff scenario, and I'll see you tomorrow for another video.